Everyone loves to get Christmas gifts. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 11 states, "And they, the Magi, came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh." In this video, we will discuss the significance of the gifts of the Magi on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. The story of the visitation of the Magi picks up after the Nativity narrative in Matthew chapter 1. This story is unique to the Gospel of Matthew, but within that Gospel, the pericope serves an important function. It is often claimed that the Synoptic Gospels don't communicate the divinity of Christ. But this passage pushes back against that claim in a very eloquent way. First, we need to dispel a couple of common myths about the gifts and the Magi. It is often suggested that there were three Magi, which is a broad term for charlatans, hucksters, magicians, sorcerers, astrologers, and legitimately learned men of obscure and mystical arts. Western tradition sometimes claims that the three Magi were named Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, whereas Syrian Christians name the Magi Larvendad, Gush-Nasaf, and Hormadas. And Ethiopian Christianity names them Hor, Karsudan, and Basanater. The problem is, there is no historical evidence that there were three Magi. The text tells us that there were at least two Magi because Magoi is used in the plural. The idea that there were three Magi comes from the assumption that because three gifts were mentioned, there are also three Magi. However, the Bible doesn't tell us how many Magi there were. A second myth is a common interpretation of the gifts, which is that each gift is symbolic of Christ's royalty, the gold, his divinity, the frankincense, and his mortality and humanity, the myrrh. This is a common interpretation among early church fathers such as Origen, layworks, and can even be found in lesser commentaries. While this is an attractive interpretation, better commentaries argue that this is not tenable, since the connection of these various symbolic meanings lacks warrant. For example, by stating that the wine offered to Christ on the cross was mixed with myrrh, Mark 15:23, instead of gall, Matthew 27:34, Mark discounts the connection between Christ's mortality and myrrh. Because if the interpretation that myrrh actually represented humanity and mortality by refusing the wine, there would be the suggestion that Christ is rejecting his humanity and mortality on the cross. This is why we always have to be careful about interpretations. So, if Matthew is not mentioning the gifts of the Magi as symbolism for the incarnation, what is happening with the gifts? Now, we have mentioned that the Magi gave Jesus at least three gifts. There could have been more gifts, but only three are mentioned in the text. And we should briefly describe what those were. Now, the gold needs little explanation. This is, of course, a soft, heavy, precious metal, the value of which is based upon its scarcity and incorruptibility. Gold neither tarnishes nor rusts, and has been a common reservoir of value since ancient times. and it was frequently used in religious implements and was seen as being ritually pure. Now, frankincense and myrrh are essentially two fragrant tree resins. Frankincense is a whitish resin from the Bowellia genus of trees. Myrrh, and I happen to have a little jar containing myrrh right here, is a yellowish red resin from the Camophora genus of trees. The taxonomy of myrrh trees is very complex, with nearly 200 known species. And it is highly possible that many different kinds of trees were used to harvest myrrh for the incense trade. The heart of the incense trade appears to originate in Eastern Africa, although Arabia and even parts of the Levant may have been a minor source of incense. See Genesis 37:25. And the patriarch Jacob, during the famine in Genesis 43:11, sends his son to Egypt with myrrh to barter for grain. In ancient times, frankincense and myrrh were portable means of wealth, having the advantage of being both costly and lightweight. Frankincense, myrrh, and other spices were also mixed to form a perfume that was part of wedding festivities. See Song of Songs, verses 3:6 and 4:14. And myrrh was even used in Israelite funerary rites, as seen in John 19:39. In ancient Egypt, myrrh was called entiu, and other kinds of incense were called senecher, which probably includes frankincense. Myrrh and frankincense were important commodities in Egypt. This incense was burnt as an offering to the gods, worn as perfume, and even used as part of a resin that was applied to lacquer furniture. Queen Hatshepsut imported myrrh trees from Punt in East Africa, which she had planted at her funerary temple at Deir el-Bahri. There are many scenes of Egyptian kings offering the gods burnt incense and gold jewelry. So, returning to the Matthew passage, the importance of the gifts for Matthew 2:11 cannot be separated from the rest of the passage. Our verse here states that Christ was found by the Magi with his mother, a literary connection that bridges the Magi account with Christ's divine conception in Matthew 1:23-25. And the Greek here indicates that Jesus was no longer an infant, in the Greek brephos, but already a toddler, paidion. And the fact that the scene with the Magi occurs in a house proper, not an inn, suggests that Mary and Joseph had moved on from the inn and were possibly living with relations in Bethlehem at this time, or had a second set of accommodations for reasons of Joseph's work situation. Nevertheless, when the Magi arrive, they find the child with his mother, bow down, and worship the child. It is important to understand that this is all taking place in a highly conservative, monotheistic Israelite culture, where worship is reserved for God alone. And the gifts confirm the nature of that worship and are directly tied to the proper worship of God. As such, Matthew 2:11 appears to also be a reference to Isaiah 60:5-6. Quote, "Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you. A multitude of camels will cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba will come. They will bring gold and frankincense, and will bear good news of the praises of the Lord." Similarly, frankincense was also an important component used in Israelite tabernacle and temple worship, where it was often mixed with burnt grain offerings, Leviticus 2:2, 2:15-16, and Leviticus 6:14. In conclusion, The Magi brought gifts that were fit for service and worship to a god. And that is what the gifts were trying to communicate. The mention of the gifts is specifically tied to the Magi's act of worship. They were learned men in their own land that traveled abroad to find the God who became human flesh and dwelled with us. So, anyway, I hope you found that interesting and learned something. Thank you so very much for watching, and we want to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.